Sleeping Beauty by the Brothers Grimm. Long ago there lived a king and queen. They had been married many years, but they had no children, and this made them very sad. One day the queen was bathing in the river and thinking of how much she wanted to have a child. A frog hopped out of the water and said to her, "Your wish will come true. Before a year passes, you will have a daughter." What the frog said would happen did come to pass. The queen had a little girl, and she was so beautiful that the king could not hide the joy he felt when he looked at her. The king decided to hold a great feast to celebrate the birth of his daughter. He invited his family, friends, and neighbors to the feast. He also invited the fairies of his kingdom, so that they would be kind and good to the little princess. There were 13 fairies in the kingdom, but the king and queen had only 12 golden plates for the fairies to eat from. So the king and queen were forced to leave out one of the fairies and did not ask her to the feast. At the feast, the fairies gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One fairy gave her goodness, another gave her wisdom, another gave her beauty, and so on. Soon the little girl had been given all that is good in the world. Suddenly the fairy who had not been invited to the feast appeared. She was very angry because she had not been asked to the feast, and she was determined to take her revenge. She cried out, "On their 13th birthday, the princess will prick herself with a spindle on a spinning wheel and die." Everyone heard the curse was terrified. But then the last of the friendly fairies, who had not yet given her gift, came forward. She could not take away the evil curse, but she could make it less powerful. She said, "The princess will not die, but will fall asleep for 100 years." The king tried to protect the child from the evil curse. He ordered all the spinning wheels in the kingdom to be burned. As the princess grew up, the gifts of the friendly fairies were fulfilled. The princess became so clever and good and beautiful that everyone who saw her fell in love with her. On the day the princess turned 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, so the princess was left alone in the palace, and she began wandering through all the rooms and passageways, going just where she pleased. At last she came to an old tower. She climbed the narrow winding staircase until she came to a door with a gold key in the lock. When she turned the key, the door sprang open, and there sat an old woman spinning away very busily. "Good day," said the princess. "What are you doing here?" "I'm spinning," said the old woman, who smiled and nodded her head. The spindle turned as she spun her thread. "How merrily the little thing turns around," said the princess. She reached out her hand to touch the spindle, but just as she did so, the fairy's evil prophecy was fulfilled. The spindle pricked the girl's finger, and she sank down on a bed that stood near and fell into a deep sleep. At that moment, everyone in the palace fell asleep. The king and the queen, who had come home, fell asleep, as did all their court. The dogs slept in the courtyard, the horses slept in the stables, the doves dozed on the roof, the flies even slept on the walls, and even the fire in the hearth stopped blazing and went to sleep. Everything stood still, and all slept soundly. A large hedge of thorns began growing around the palace, and every year it became higher and thicker. At last the palace was almost completely hidden by the thorns. Only the roof and the palace towers could be seen. Through the land there went out a report of the beautiful Sleeping Beauty, as the sleeping princess came to be called, and from time to time brave young men came and tried to cut through the hedge into the palace. But none of them could succeed, for the thorns held them back, and they were unable to force their way through the hedge into the castle. Many years later, a prince came into that land. He heard the story of the Sleeping Beauty and of the many young men who had tried to break through the thorny hedge. "I'm not afraid," he thought. "I will go and see the Sleeping Beauty." Now that very day the 100 years were ended, and Sleeping Beauty was to wake again. As the young prince came near the hedge, the thorns turned to huge, beautiful flowers. The flowers parted so that he could pass through to the palace, and then closed in behind him. The prince saw the dogs sleeping in the courtyard and the horses asleep in the stable. He saw the doves sleeping on the roof with their heads under their wings. When he came into the palace, he found the king and queen asleep in the throne room. The prince went on further, and everything was so quiet that he could hear himself breathe. At last the prince came to the tower where Sleeping Beauty lay fast asleep. She looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her, and he stooped down and kissed her. Just as he did so, she opened her eyes and smiled at him. Then they went down to the throne room together, and the king and queen awoke, as did all the court. The horses shook themselves, the dogs jumped up and barked, the doves flew away into the fields, and flies on the walls buzzed again, and the fire in the hearth blazed up. The whole palace was once more in motion as if nothing had happened, for the 100 years' sleep had made no change in anyone. The prince and Sleeping Beauty were married, and the great wedding feast was given, and they lived together happily until the end of their lives.